Hello, everyone. I'm Captain Logan, and it's not Spawn year. Hey, everybody, crack open a beer, get ready to celebrate, even if it's 10 a.m. when this video first uploads, because, my friends, we have finally made it to the 10th episode. A giant landmark achievement. I can't even believe it. Get your beer, get your Tick party hat. I know everybody's got one of these. It's going to be a spectacular landmark episode. I've spent millions of dollars on this video. We're going to have fireworks. We're going to have a parade with elephants. We're going to have donuts, like very expensive donuts at the Krispy Kreme where the Zeo crystal is buried underneath. We've spared no expense. We're going to have a blimp. Hey, look, I've got a blimp. It's a big deal. And because I didn't expect to get this far, and I'm sure you didn't either. And so I'm celebrating our 10th episode as if it were the 100th because it feels like I've made that many already. And I could have waited until the 100th episode to review the Tick number 100, but I just couldn't help myself because I love the Tick. He's my favorite superhero, or at least that's vying for the top spot up against Batman all the time, back and forth. And B, I finally have watched the first season of and read a little bit of Invincible in comics, and I know who that is now, and so I knew I wouldn't be lost cracking this open and looking at it finally. I've never actually read this, and this came out back in 2012, and I'm not sure if it's like lampooning the practice of legacy numbering. I don't even know if this counts exactly as legacy numbering, taking all of the issues collectively that exist for a character or a property and putting them, counting all the way up and going, okay, collectively we have now this big monumental number in order to kind of manufacture an exciting moment. So when you look at something like Ninja Turtles or like Spawn, oh wait, it's not Spawn here, excuse me. When books like that get to issue 100, you have 99 issues consecutively before that were numbered that way, even if you also had miniseries and one-shots around it. Not the case with something like The Tick, where this is more like Mario Kart, where you have several games that collectively we numbered once we got to Nintendo 3DS for some reason and said, Mario Kart 7, and then Mario Kart 8. And that's been going for a decade now, and we haven't continued numbering because we didn't make any more after that. We've just stuck with that one game. I digress, but it's an odd practice. I'm kind of more okay with it for something like The Tick because it does feel like a big deal getting here. We're from the late 80s to now or to 2012 anyway, when this comes out. It's kind of impressive that there are a total of 100 issues because it's not an ongoing. It only comes out every so often. You'd get the occasional one-shot miniseries. You get free comic book day issues. I don't actually know if those count in this whole thing. I haven't counted it up, but I think it's just the original Edlin series and the specials, the holiday things, some miniseries, and then the only other ongoing we got up to this point. There was another attempt at one a few years after that didn't go very well, that only had, I think, 3 or 4 issues, and I didn't care for, written by Cullen Bunn. But this is actually unintentionally the penultimate issue of the Tick new series, which got 12 issues written by Benito Cereno and drawn by, I forget his name right off, Les McLean. And uh, the plan was for this to kind of wrap up a lot of the story that he'd been building through that series and then continue on with several crossovers with other independent comic superheroes. So Tick number 100 is really the beginning of a new series that would be the Tick Meets series. And so Tick meets Invincible, and then in 101, Tick meets Madman. And it was supposed to continue. I've not read that issue either, so I don't know if that ends on a cliffhanger, but I know the plan was to continue on with those, and 102 was solicited and never came out. And it's been 10 years, and there was 11 years now, and there was an attempt again at another series later, so it must have been canceled and, in kind of a hush-hush way and just never talked about. So it's kind of ironic that that the only other Tick ongoing up to this point also gets canceled prematurely and with no fanfare and no explanation, like Ben Edlund's series. I mean, the difference is Edlund ends his run on a cliffhanger with issue 12. There was supposed to be one more issue, and then the animated series happens. He gets wrapped up in Hollywood, working on different TV shows, and just never gets around to finishing it. I've reviewed this before. Years ago, I did Tick Month, and I reviewed issue 13, which was kind of a what if, or like how this might have ended. Not how it should have ended, but how it might have ended, written by a different author and drawn by a different artist. And it's okay. It's probably not anything like what Edlund would have done, but gave people sort of some closure, I guess, if they needed that. This ends for different reasons, obviously, and I assume Serino didn't just quit and would have wanted to continue this and finish his run. So I don't know the story there, but he gets 14 issues, so just a couple more than Edlund does, but weirdly, only 12 issues of the series that actually has the title, the Tick New Series, all the way through. So technically, it actually ends in the same place Ben Edlund's did number-wise, even though it does get a couple more issues that continue that story. So that's kind of odd. I would love to talk to Benito Cereno again and find out what happened with this whole thing, what the story is. I interviewed him a long time ago when this had just come out, I think, or maybe it had been out for a year or so. And we really hit it off. We had a lot of stuff in common. He's a big They Might Be Giants fan, like I am, and we intended to keep in touch and keep talking, and that didn't end up happening for whatever reason. So I don't know. I should hit him up and see if he remembers me and if he wants to chat again, because I'd love to know what the story is on this. And he doesn't have another comic credit past this, so I'm sure there's some kind of a story there. Let's talk about the story that is here, shall we? So it's the Tick meets Invincible, which seems like kind of a counterintuitive, odd, off-the-beaten-path choice for a big celebratory landmark issue like this. And the reason that happens, I suspect, is because Invincible is actually where, or at least that universe, where Benito Cereno gets his start. So he wrote for some spin-offs, including Rexplode and a couple of other things for Invincible, but, over at Image, but had never, working for Kirkman, but never actually got to write Invincible himself. And so he uses this as an opportunity to go back to his roots, go back to that character who's really going strong at this point, and put him up with the Tick. And it would have been kind of nice to get maybe a mini-series that crossed them over, as opposed to doing it as just a singular issue that continues the story from his run. But in so few pages that Cereno has to work with here, he gets a surprising amount accomplished, and he nails the blend of tones between these two characters. It is so interesting to see these two guys on the same page for lots of reasons. So first of all, and then I'll get to the history post this, because that gets fascinating. But you've got two characters that live in kind of quirky, somewhat wacky worlds. One of them, with the Tick, is more of a parody of comics, more of of superhero comics, more of a farce. And there's a parody component, I would say, to Invincible also, but I would describe it as almost more of a humorous deconstruction of superhero comics and of modern, more serious, violent superhero comics than the Tick is. And there, I mean, you can make the argument that the Tick has some deconstruction with it too, I guess, just by the nature of like taking some of the just inherently absurd things that are in comics that take themselves too seriously, and putting a mirror up to that. But the big point that Sereno is making with in kind of showing us these two characters, staring at each other, is one of them has a universe where typically nothing bad really seems to happen to at least our protagonist. And the Tick can get disturbing. There's a lot of weird things that happen in particularly the Ben Edlund run, and the Tick is an endearing character in his way, but he's also kind of off, and he starts off as a mental patient. You never totally know what his background is, where you stand with him, and that's part of the joke. But his world is inherently sort of an innocent one in its way, and Invincible is, of course, not that way. So it's fun. It can get really absurd, but it also gets away with taking itself super seriously, and it's all about actions and consequences. So the Tick is more of an absent-minded superhero where he always wins at the end of the day because his heart's in the right place. And Invincible is much more of a Spider-Man type character where he does have his heart in the right place most of the time, but he does make a lot of mistakes. And just like with Peter Parker, regardless of what his intentions are, there are often a lot of negative consequences. And you roll the dice and you see where they're going to land, and you never really know what's going to happen. And there are a lot of consequences to his super heroing, and there's always that question, again, like with Spider-Man, if he's causing more problems than he's solving. And with the Tick, you never really have that question, or when you do, it's played as a joke. So like the stakes aren't as high, I guess, is the point. And there are consequences with the Tick, like he jumps on roofs and he destroys public property and that sort of thing. And there is sometimes a cynicism, almost like a harmless cynicism with the Tick, where he lives in a world that is not fair and bad things happen to people, but he's the hero. He always wins at the end of the day, and so nothing really bad happens to him except for here. So when Invincible shows up, it's like he kind of brings some of his universe to the Tick's universe. I always talk with comic crossovers that are interdimensional in nature, in bringing these characters together because they don't exist in the same continuity in the first place. I always talk about whether or not we spend too much time on how that mechanism works. And this is a really good example of handling that economically. And I also really like that the MacGuffin, the device that creates this possibility, is actually introduced in the series earlier if you've been reading the Tick News series. And so it feels like all roads were actually leading here in the first place, maybe, and, in a real absurd kind of way. But the Tick says here that he fought the Terror, and there was a gun that was supposed to send him to a different time period, but actually sent him to a different dimension. And that immediately gives us an excuse to bring Invincible over, when that gun will be used by our big villain, who's been seeded since the beginning of the Tick new series, apparently. And I've read some of that, but it's been a long time. So all this was real recappy for me. And by the way, it's pretty easy to read this in a vacuum, particularly if, of course, you've spent any time with either of these characters. I like the letter that Sereno has at the end of this. It's wonderful and fun. And he says, if you've never read either of these characters and you just like issue 100s and that's why you bought it, I can't really help you very much. And I thought that was really funny. But you have this villain who's been in the background this whole time, who ends up using this gun. And apparently there's been all these machinations. So several of the plots against the Tick that had some kind of mysterious force behind them, this Martian guy was at the root of all of it. And so this is a big payoff if you've been reading that series. And I'll talk about him for just a second. He is a classic sort of, kind of a vintage sort of Tick villain in parroting a couple of things at once. Edlund was always going to whatever was popular in comics and doing really amusing and clever farces with them. And so here we combine Martian Manhunter and Marvin Martian into Martin of Mars. And so he has all the powers and technology of both of those characters and is bordering on trademark infringement on both of them, but like it's a parody, so not really. And it's absolutely hilarious. At one point he says something very similar to the what is it, the P3 space modulator from Marvin Martian or whatever that thing is called. But we go back to the Edlund series and bring back Otter Creekite. If you're familiar with that, there's a Superman parody where he's got kryptonite, but it's called Otter Creekite. And there's a lot of great references, by the way, to all the early Tick stuff. And at one point he says, you're making me very, very angry. But he also has all of Martian Manhunter's powers. And obviously he's got the midsection of that. So that's really funny. But this is so weird reading 10, 11 years later, retroactively, because it doesn't feel like it's been that long ago since it came out, but the world has changed so much since then. So DC has done this joke, like did their own crossover during a month of Looney Tune comics where they blend Looney Tunes, and actually they've done this twice now, unless they've done it again and I don't know about it because I haven't been keeping up lately. But there was a Marvin Martian and Martian Manhunter crossover where those two characters come together in the same comic, and this sort of does that before that, and so that was surreal to read. But the other thing that's very surreal, of course, is that there is now a very significant thing that Tick and Invincible have in common, which is they both have had series that adapted their respective comics to screen on Amazon. And as much as I like the Invincible cartoon and a TV show, which I've reviewed now, I can't say cartoon, it's an animated series, I'm still a little bit bitter about what happened with the Amazon Tick series because it got canceled prematurely. The second season didn't get enough of a budget, so Edlund had to completely rewrite it and change a lot of what he was planning and put a lot of things off to a expected proposed third season. And it still just guts me that that season never got made. And the very next thing that Amazon greenlights is, maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's the Invincible, maybe it's The Boys. I forget which thing comes out. I guess The Boys must come out first, right? And then we get Invincible. So they've had success with adult, violent superhero shows that are inherently absurd, and they started with something like that with The Tick, and it was wonderful and got canceled, and then both of those shows have been huge and continue on to this day. So Again, I'm still sad about that. I'm still a little bit bitter about it, but it makes it really odd and surreal to see these two things together well before any of that got greenlit. So, like I said, Sereno has such a good head for both of these characters, good voice for both of them, and focuses on all the right things with them. So, right away, the title of this issue is Nigh Invincible, which is a lot of fun because the Tick always says that he's nigh invulnerable, and that plays thematically into this as well. It starts off as the goofy, farcical thing that you would expect it would. Chairface breaks out of jail because it's a big, landmark, important issue, so you got to have the Tick's main villain, and then he's taken out of the issue in 3 pages. He shows up just to get beaten up by the real villain of the issue, and then he's gone. And so that's unexpected and hilariously anticlimactic. I really liked that a lot. And then it's not too long before suddenly it's more of an Invincible comic, and it's taking itself a little bit more seriously, and but still through a goofy, absurd kind of situation where Martin the Martian, or Martin of Mars, accidentally murders Arthur. He disintegrates him and didn't actually mean to do that. And suddenly there's a lot of pathos to the Tick that you've not necessarily really seen before. By the way, I love this double page spread where the Tick is suddenly engaging in a lot of bloody violence that he's never really done before. And he's about to have a rude awakening where it starts with just a bit of good fun, where it's like we're fighting these beings that are not self-aware, and so we Invincible and the Tick feel like they have license to just wipe the floor with them and basically murder them with their fists, like you see all over the Invincible TV show. It just gets really gruesome and hard to watch in places, honestly, particularly that last episode of the first season. And then Arthur, or pardon me, the Tick is like, wow, this is really gross, and Invincible says you get used to it, which is oddly foreshadowing for how heavy things are about to get, where slowly, gradually, Invincible is bringing his world to the Tick, and it starts with the fun side of the violence, and then it turns into the really tragic, traumatic side of his world. And the Tick never breaks character. When he and Invincible go and take down the bad guy, they leave him out in space, and he's like, again, it still stays in this humorous mode, but there's a weight to it that you don't really get usually in the Tick. And I found myself like really feeling something and expecting at some point to turn the page and Arthur is just standing there and it was all a misunderstanding, because we don't do this in Tick comics. And that sort of kind of happens at the end, but not just in like a search for Spock sort of way, where we know we're not going to keep Arthur dead, but there is, again, this kind of weight to it, this heavy sadness that I couldn't help but actually get invested in a little bit, even though I know that there's no way that we keep the status quo and that Arthur stays dead. But the Tick goes on this speech toward the end where he's like, who's going to be my sidekick now? Who's going to be my buddy? And it's a funny speech. Again, he never breaks character, but it's also pretty sad. And Invincible gets this new sense of perspective about the world he lives in and how lucky he is that he still has his sidekick, Eve. So there's a nice moment with them toward the end. And then on the very last page, it gets back to wacky hijinks. And because it's a big, important issue we've got to do the crazy comic book multiverse stuff. And so this other Arthur from the 40s shows up, curiously says he's been hopping dimensions and 3 decades. So, like, does he think he's in the 70s? I didn't really understand that line. It's funny. But you've seen this 1,000 times in movies and comics where, it reminds me of, like, the last scene of the Super Mario Brothers movie or the end of Back to the Future, where somebody shows up in, wearing crazy garb from another time or another place, and says, hey, we've got to go jump into this vortex and go stop some sort of problem that you're not even aware of. So this is the Arthur from the 40s who's wearing this crazy makeshift getup and says, I have a way to resurrect Arthur, and you're going to have to follow me. And so at some point, I'll read issue 101 and see what becomes of that. And again, I'm assuming that probably also ends on a cliffhanger that was never resolved, which is unfortunate. But yeah, I enjoyed this a lot, and it is a like really niche kind of thing. Like, you do kind of have to appreciate the humor sensibilities and the storytelling sensibilities of both of these characters, I think. But it's maybe the only writer, except for perhaps Robert Kirkman himself, I would say, that I could see doing justice to both of these characters, throwing them in a pot together like this. I would love, by the way, to see, and not to take anything away from Sereno, because I like his voice for the Tick, and his series is not exactly what I want from that world. Some of the characters that he introduces are fun. They feel like they fit in that universe, but I kind of wish we focused on other people more. But it was certainly kind of novel to get a longer running story again that was serialized, because it had been a long time since we'd had that with the Tick. But yeah, so nothing taking away from his work. But boy, I would be interested to see Kirkman tackle the Tick and see what he would do with it. So anyway, that is my 10th episode spectacular. Wasn't it just wonderful? Did you see all the fireworks? Did you see the lion tamer in the background? Did you see the pants that were on fire? The giant pair of pants? Dolphins jumping into them? I hope you saw that, because it was very exciting. Anyway, I will be back with you again tomorrow for another one. Thanks so much for tuning in, and happy reading, everybody.